with special thanks to my daughter, before I go any further, Layla, for saving me from some of the inadvertent humour in this paper. I expect that some of the other inadvertent humour is still in there. I did suggest to her that she might like to come this afternoon so that she could hear one proper lecture before she starts her BA at the University of Toronto in the fall. But very wisely, she decided not to interrupt her spring break. Some of you will have noticed that the tagline for UBC's Celebrate Learning Week in May is the power of place. Remember place of mind, place and promise, the power of place. We have a bit of a hang-up here on our sense of place. Power of place really is thought-provoking, isn't it? Whose power, whose place, since when, for how much longer? When we acknowledge, as I do again now, that Green College sits on a particularly well-appointed piece of the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, we summon a long, complex, continuing and very challenging history of place naming, space taking, of taking place, and of making space. I want to try to unravel one strand in that history in this talk, or at least begin to do so. It is just the beginning of an unraveling. Still, it is going to take me a while. So if you're worried about the traffic getting back to the North Shore, don't feel you need to stay till the end. There are two exits, so just check now and see what the exits may be behind you. There's one over there, there's one here. And now if you'd like to fasten your seatbelts, we will take off. What or where is literature? At first, I thought it was only on WestJet. Then I noticed British Airways was doing it too. You clamber aboard, sling your carry-on luggage in the overhead bin, shimmy into your row, and slump down on your seat to be faced by a prohibition on the seat back in front of you. Literature only. Literature only. The first time I eyeballed that instruction was on a short-haul WestJet flight. There was no seat-back entertainment screen. How blissful. A flight on which there would be no screen time, only literature. Model flyer that I am, ever responsive to commands from crew members or the seat back in front of me, I got my book out and was quickly lost in it. But no, even I knew instantly that WestJet was not sponsoring an in-flight literature promotion to compete with some Air Canada Reads initiative. Had I been in any doubt, the French version of literature only would have put me right. Papier seulement. Paper only. Just paper. The slot at the top of the back seat in front of me was big enough to hold a flight safety guide, a magazine, and a menu, plus any legible item of my own that I might want to insert, such as, I don't know, a slim volume of verse. Some of you will have had similar reactions to such onboard commands. If you're of a certain age and background, you may also have been struck by this sudden reappearance of the word literature in a public place. For when did any of us last see that word on a sign in a library or in a bookstore? 10 years ago, when the Vancouver chapter's Indigo at Granville and Broadway was still just a chapter's, the largest section of its main book floor was signed literature and fiction, as if to say, you may be a bit unsure of the difference between literature and fiction, or whether there even is one. Don't worry, whatever you're after, it's in there somewhere under the author's name. Except it isn't anymore, because now that area of Indigo has two separate sections. One marked fiction and the other history, leaving us to wonder where any remaining literature may have been stowed, if not in a narrow slot on an airline seatback. I thought I might be making this up, but I checked with a long-serving Chapters Indigo employee who confirmed that the signage was changed a few years ago. So my memory of the old chapters is history, not fiction. For book-selling purposes, the category of literature is now evidently obsolete. Want novels or short stories? Look under fiction. Want memoir? Check first under autobiography in the history section. Want poetry or drama? See if you can find a small shelf marked poetry or drama. What? You want literary criticism? Don't make me laugh. Nobody wants literary criticism these days, do they? Well, there is a shelf there. You can probably just make out the sign saying literary criticism. Much harder to make out is the existence of any book of literary criticism on that shelf. And so, anatomies of criticism. In the 10th annual Ericson lecture, given here in the Coach House in November 2021, as we nervously edged out from under the lockdown, Mariana Valverde from the Center for Criminology at the University of Toronto spoke about infrastructure as a keyword of our time. She was using keyword in the special heuristic sense it had been given by the Cambridge literary and cultural critic Raymond Williams in his 1976 book, Keywords, subtitled A Vocabulary of Culture and Society. Infrastructure wasn't actually one of the words whose evolving meaning and socio-cultural significance Williams tracked in that book, but literature was. Literature is a difficult word, Williams wrote, in part because its conventional contemporary meaning appears at first sight so simple. There is no apparent difficulty in phrases like English literature or contemporary literature until we find occasion to ask whether all books and writing are literature, and if they're not, which kinds are excluded and by what criteria. Or until, to take a significant example, we come across a distinction between literature and drama, on the grounds apparently that drama is a form primarily written for spoken performance, though often also to be read. It's not easy to understand what is at stake in these often confused distinctions until we look at the history of the word. But as Williams then showed, that word history is also extremely difficult to untangle. I won't attempt to summarize his account of it here, only observing, on the basis of my own fieldwork in aeroplanes and local bookstores, that the simplicity that he could claim in 1976 for the conventional contemporary meaning of phrases like English literature or contemporary literature is perhaps somewhat less apparent now than it was to him and others, myself included, half a century ago. In fact, it might be fair to say, spinning off Mariana Valverde's Ericson lecture, that in retrospect, the word literature, as used in phrases like those instanced by Williams, is beginning in this time to look more and more like a keyword from a former time, namely the 20th century. We may even suspect that literature, as a term once freely used for a certain kind of cognitive and affective infrastructure, has gone into eclipse, partly because of the rise of expanded conceptions of infrastructure of the kind that are now the subject of university courses in the field of critical infrastructure studies. Was there not once an emergent field of critical literature studies, or literary criticism for short? There was, of course, and its golden age was the mid-20th century. Williams's Keywords was a delayed follow-up to the book that made his name, Culture and Society, 1780 to 1950, published in 1958. Almost half of the third and final part of that earlier work was devoted to the opinions of T.S. Eliot, the centenary of whose poem The Wasteland we marked, or missed, last year, and of two pioneering members of the Cambridge English faculty, I.A. Richards and F.R. Leavis, of whom more in a moment. Oh, there they are. The year before Williams's Culture and Society was published by Chatto and Windus in London, Princeton University Press published a book that would, for a quarter of a century, be the most famous work of literary criticism of all time, with the word criticism in its title. Anatomy of Criticism was written by a professor of English at the University of Toronto, Northrop Frye, and opened with a polemical introduction that still makes bracing reading today. If the study of literature were a properly constituted academic discipline like other disciplines, Frye argued, it ought to be possible to issue an elementary textbook expounding its fundamental principles. It would be interesting, he said, to see what such a book on criticism would contain. It would not start with a clear answer to the first question of all: what is literature? That question in French had been the title of a set of lectures by Jean-Paul Sartre, published as a book in 1948, while Frye was completing a draft for his polemical introduction, which came out in the University of Toronto Quarterly for 1949, under a title borrowed from Matthew Arnold and previously repurposed by T.S. Eliot, among others: The Function of Criticism at the Present Time. Back now to Frye in the Anatomy. We have no standards, he says, to distinguish a verbal structure that is literary from one that is not, and no idea what to do with the vast number of books that may be claimed for literature because they're written with style, or are useful as background, or have simply got into a university course of great books. We then discover that we have no word corresponding to poem in poetry or play in drama to describe a literary work in art. To riff off Frye's last point, if poetry consists of poems, drama of plays, then what is literature if not just print on a page, papier seulement? Or as the French poet Paul Verlaine polemically put it in 1872, tout le reste est littérature. Literature is what's left over after poetry. That's why the masterly Manx critic and sometime King Edward VII Professor of English at Cambridge, Frank Kermode, in a memoir, entitled the chapter about his career as a teacher of literature, The Rest. A story now to the same point. It's one I tell students in my honours and graduate classes on the modern history of literary criticism, and it enables me to pay tribute to one of the founders of Green College. In 1985, 3 years before I set foot on this campus and 8 years before Green College opened its doors, UBC appointed a new president. Patricia Merivale, cover your ears. He was a brilliant geophysicist named David Strangway, one of the scientists who had analysed the moon rock brought back by the Apollo astronauts. Dr. Strangway had been both vice president and interim president of the University of Toronto and may have been a bit ticked off not to have been confirmed as president of U of T. In any case, soon after his arrival at UBC, he declared his intention to make this university second to none. There are people in this room, myself included, who remember this moment. And he was nearly as good as his word. It's in no small measure thanks to David Strangway that UBC became the flourishing institution it still is. And it was in large part thanks to his friendship with Cecil Green, whose company, Texas Instruments, made equipment for geophysical surveys, that Green College was born. Back in the 1980s, more leisurely times, new university presidents visited all departments on campus. And so at some point, President Strangway dropped in on the Department of English in the Buchanan Tower, or so I'm told. It was before my time, so if I've got the story wrong, my senior colleagues will correct me, as they always have in the past. Of course, the president is reported to have told them that day, English as a subject doesn't change much over time, does it? In that respect, it's a bit like human anatomy. Now, the story as I've heard it is always told against the president, as if to say, can you believe it? This know-nothing geophysicist from Toronto breezes into our department and dares to suggest that professors of English are like anatomy lecturers. These scientists, such Philistines. But I wonder, David Strangway had surely appointed a few professors of English at U of T and must have had a shrewd idea of what they were like and how to wind them up. He would certainly have known, if only by title, a book by one of them, Anatomy of Criticism. Northrop Frye's masterpiece was still on English literature syllabuses in the 1980s at UBC and elsewhere in Canada and the United States and even beyond. I like to think that President Strangway made quite a good joke when he visited my future home department at UBC. Maybe an even better joke than he knew he was making. For if anyone ever needed to be convinced of the difference between literature and human anatomy as academic disciplines, Anatomy of Criticism would do it. Frye's purpose, as he stated in the polemical introduction from which I've already quoted, was finally to establish the study of literature as a science. And yet the account that he gave of literature in his book was radically unlike any previously offered under the heading of criticism. Nothing less akin, we'll have that one now, so as not to miss the moment. Anything less akin than the anatomy of criticism to Gray's Anatomy, by then in at least its 30th edition, could be imagined. And this is one of the points at which I have to thank my daughter for pointing out that unless I had a slide, everybody would think I was talking about a television series rather than a medical textbook. In any case, oh, by the way, the slide I would go back to now if I only knew how to put this thing into reverse. The one with the image of Vesalius's De Fabrica Humani Corporis, whatever it's called. That anatomy, the original Vesalian anatomy, we have a first edition in special collections. It used to be in the Woodward IRC, and it's there because of the book lust of William Gibson, the same man who helped shake Cecil Green down for the gift that made Green College possible. That's really why the Vesalius is there. Sorry I gave it such short shrift. But in any case, Frye's model was never Gray's Anatomy, or so he'd wish us to believe, the gloriously idiosyncratic anatomy. Wait a minute. It's already there, wasn't it? There we are. Anatomy of Melancholy, composed by Robert Burton, first published in London as a stout quarto in 1621, then in serially augmented folio editions over the next decade and a half. Volumes far too bulky ever to be opened on a tray table in economy class. In a moment, we will glance inside Burton's anatomy, then return to Frye before deplaning. But first, a short detour via another mode of transport. 3 men in a boat, to say nothing of the dog. The slide shows the title page of the first edition, 1889, of the book of that title, by Jerome K. Jerome, in a copy from the UBC library that's been so brutally rebound as to make it nearly unreadable. Fortunately, the introductory summary for Chapter 1 tells us everything we need to know for now. The three men in question, are hypochondriacs or melancholics, and they're about to hit upon the idea of rowing upstream from London to Oxford as a remedy for their condition. Boating on the Thames was becoming a popular pastime in the late Victorian era as commercial traffic on the river declined with the rise of rail freight. Suddenly, little boats were everywhere. But I'm getting ahead of our narrator, whom we discover on page 2, head down in a tome far weightier than the one I fished out of storage at the UBC library. And by the way, the words anatomy and tome have the same root in a Greek verb meaning to cut or section. An anatomy theatre is where a body is cut open and cut up for examination. A tome, in the bibliographical sense, was originally a section or cut-off length of a papyrus roll. This will be important later. But here, now, is our man. It is a most extraordinary thing, he says, but I never read a patent medicine advertisement without being impelled to the conclusion that I'm suffering from the particular disease therein dealt with in its most virulent form. The diagnosis seems in every case to correspond exactly with all the sensations that I've ever felt. He goes on, I remember going to the British Museum one day to read up the treatment for some slight ailment of which I had a touch, hay fever, I fancy it was. I got down the book and read all I came to read. And then, in an unthinking moment, I idly turned the leaves and began to indolently study diseases generally. We can skip a few pages of the medical dictionary over which our hypochondriac is poring to catch him on the next page of his own narrative. I sat and pondered. I thought, what an interesting case I must be from a medical point of view. What an acquisition I should be to a class. Students would have no need to walk the hospitals if they had me. I was a hospital in myself. All they need do would be walk round me. And after that, take their diploma. Our man about town has become a masterclass in morbid anatomy. But only by first becoming a spectator of himself in an out-of-body experience made possible by a compendious book in a room, the domed, circular reading room of the British Museum, around whose walls, section by section in encyclopedic fashion, were ranged reference books for all the recognized disciplines of serious human knowledge, and at whose desks dozens of human subjects sat bowed like him over printed pages. Every well-equipped library reading room is, or once was, a theatre of human anatomy. I had walked into that reading room a happy, healthy man, our specimen relates. I crawled out a decrepit wreck. Who among us has not at some time had a library experience like that? Reading real books can be an arduous activity, not usually because of the strain put on our wrists by heavy folios or the necessity of prizing open volumes that have been inexpertly rebound, but because of the variety of cognitive and affective states, not all of them conscious, that reading puts us into and through. To quote our hypochondriac again, in an unthinking moment, I idly turned the leaves and began indolently to study. I sat for a while, frozen with horror, and then, in the listlessness of despair, I again turned over the pages. I felt rather hurt at first. After a while, however, less grasping feelings prevailed. I sat and pondered. Then I wondered how long I had to live. No one was studying the psychology of reading in 1889 when Jerome K. Jerome floated 3 men in a boat, to say nothing of the dog. The credit for pioneering that field goes to I.A. Richards, who began lecturing on literary criticism in the newly created Faculty of English at Cambridge shortly after the First World War, and who quickly brought his training as an experimental psychologist to bear on the subject. In 1924, Richards published Principles of Literary Criticism, and then in 1929, Practical Criticism, a work that is commonly regarded as a founding charter for the close reading of poems and other literary texts in Anglophone university classrooms. Towards the end of the book, Richards recommends testing the value of one's response to a poem by considering it, I quote him, in a frame of feelings whose sincerity is beyond our questioning. His checklist of considerations for this purpose, though less morbid than those exercising the narrator in 3 Men in a Boat, was similarly existential. Ponder how long you have to live, Richards tells his readers. Pass the poem through the mind, silently reciting it as slowly as it allows, and whether what it can stir in us is important or not to us will perhaps show itself then. A later Cambridge critic would be less ceremonious. When you find yourself in a prisoner of war camp with dysentery and a collection of Yeats's poetry, you find out which the great poems are. Practical Criticism was the report of an experiment that pulled selected English poems of somewhat variable quality out of published anthologies or the collected works of their individual authors and issued them on loose sheets, papier seulement, to human subjects who were invited to write down their responses to them. In the lectures that he summarized for the book, Richards dissected the responses, most of which were from Cambridge undergraduates, to produce a psychopathology of reading or morbid anatomy of criticism. The book contains an unalphabetical dictionary of maladies commonly affecting readers of poetry and concludes with a prescription entitled Suggestions Towards a Remedy. How massively consequential Richards's diagnostic has been over the past century for the academic study not merely of poetry but of literature or literary texts in general has been put beyond doubt by recent works of Anglospheric disciplinary retrospection by seasoned professors in departments of English. And there's just a clutch of them. None of these books merely nostalgic or dismissive, all of them quite urgently of our present moment. If, as some have loudly feared, academic literary criticism has been up a creek without a paddle for a while now, at least those of us still aboard have the comfort of knowing which boat we are in and who first punted it out of the placid backwaters of the Cam. It was I.A. Richards. Besides Three Men in a Boat, Jerome K. Jerome's other book of 1889 was called Idle Thoughts of an Idle Fellow. You have the measure of him, I think. But he was publishing such trifles amidst an explosion of high-grade late Victorian poetry, prose fiction, and literary criticism. The same year, 1889, saw the posthumous publication of the poetical works of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's critical annotations, edited from marginal notes that he'd left in his books, as well as of new works in verse and prose by Robert Bridges, Robert Browning, George Gissing, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and the young W.B. Yeats. Matthew Arnold had died the year before, but not before publishing a second series of the essays in criticism in which, since the 1860s, he'd been modelling a practice of literary criticism that was meant to put that activity at the moral centre of British national culture, or roughly where the Church of England would previously have been. Not only in Great Britain, but elsewhere in Europe too. The late 19th century was the time of the coming of age of literature in the modern sense of that L word, at once as the commercial product of steam-driven printing presses, supplying reading matter to an expanding middle class, and as an ideological construct elaborated by critics, moralists, and a few immoralists too, in search of aesthetic principles by which to order their own and other people's lives. The revolutionary British literary critics of the early to mid-20th century, T.S. Eliot, born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri, I.A. Richards, born in 1893 in Cheshire, England, and F.R. Leavis, born in 1895 in Cambridge, England, were all inheritors of that late 19th century, late romantic literary and critical mindset. They were the three men, without the dog, whose theoretical and pedagogical improvisations lastingly shaped our curricula. By the time Leavis and Richards died, I'd almost completed a BA in English at Cambridge, for which the final exam, in practical criticism, was set on principles established half a century earlier. Jerome K. Jerome knew what he was doing. Three Men in a Boat is a flimsily unsinkable pleasure vessel launched into the heavy river traffic of contemporary English literature to pilot a course from the reading room of the British Museum, where Karl Marx did his research, to the dreaming spas of Oxford, where Matthew Arnold, a few years before the publication of the first volume of Das Kapital, delivered a lecture on the function of criticism at the present time. We've seen what damage an afternoon in the British Museum did to our boater's fragile constitution. Having rowed up the Thames to Oxford, he and his two human companions would manifest no interest whatsoever in the university, while the dog, Montmorency, took great pleasure in the canine company of the town. Ballasted with passages of self-consciously fine writing, Jerome's fictitious, facetious travel memoir navigates ingenuously and satirically between the shoals of the shilling shockers and the cataracts of higher literature and learning. The author's preface to the reader gives the game away in advance. The chief beauty of this book, he says, lies not so much in its literary style or in the extent and usefulness of the information it conveys, as in its simple truthfulness. Its pages form the record of events that really happened. All that has been done is to colour them. And for this, no extra charge has been made. History, not fiction, or maybe something in between. Jerome K. Jerome knew what he was about. And so, to what I call the page view option. I first turned the pages of Three Men in a Boat, believe it or not, nearly 50 years ago, very fast. Conscious that a liberal education might no longer be sufficient for young men and women in the later 20th century, my high school also provided elements of mechanical instruction. With extraordinary prescience, since no one in the 1970s could have foreseen that men with our education would ever need to keyboard text for themselves unless they became novelists or journalists, we were given a chance to take touch typing lessons, easily the most useful thing I learnt at school besides Latin. With less prescience, since no one in the 1970s could have foreseen that the future would fall into the hands of Twitter users like Donald Trump, we were also sold a speed reading course to enable us to assimilate long documents as efficiently as John F. Kennedy reputedly had. The training in that course was rigorously mechanical. Each of us was loaned a battery-powered device that drove a horizontal plastic ruler down a page of print at a speed that could be controlled by turning a knob on the handle aligned with the left-hand margin of the text. I'm seeing sort of glances of recognition from some of you around here. Yeah? Did you have one of these things too for a bit? Or you knew somebody who had, yeah? Secret speed reader next door. Having kept one's reading eye ahead of the descending ruler as far as the bottom of the first page, one then dragged the ruler back to the top of its range and started on the next. To approximate the experience as closely as possible to the late President Kennedy's, our freelance instructors chose as the trial document for the class 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. They too knew what they were doing. The book is one to drift through dozily on a summer afternoon, but it can also be skimmed at a considerable clip with hardly any loss of narrative coherence. Even some of the jokes can be caught on the fly. Up 10, our instructors would excitedly cry as one or another of us guffawed. For as long as we still had time to laugh, we were not yet reading at our terminal velocity and needed to accelerate by 10 lines a minute. Our goal, after all, was the opposite of the state of hypertension induced in Jerome's reader by his stint in the British Museum. It was to become completely impassive readers, mechanically ingesting information. I.A. Richards once wrote, "It is absurd to read everything, poetry, prose, pulp, alike, especially to read it all as fast as possible. Whom are they fleeing, these running readers? I fear the only answer is themselves. Anything that is worth studying should be read as slowly as it will let you, and read again and again till you have it by heart." Those words are from a funny little book of Richards's, published in the US in 1942 and entitled How to Read a Page, A Course in Efficient Reading with an Introduction to 100 Great Words. It was meant partly as a corrective to Mortimer Adler's 1940 book, How to Read a Book, The Art of Getting a Liberal Education, with a list of 100 great books. Which was a manifesto, Adler's book, for great books of Western civilization programs of the kind Adler himself had been instrumental in setting up at the University of Chicago. By 1942, Richards had moved from Cambridge, England to Cambridge, Massachusetts. As a faculty member at Harvard, he participated in discussions that would issue in 1945 in the report of a committee of which he was a member on general education in a free society, a publication known as the Harvard Red Book. In the Harvard Red Book, one can see how routines of practical criticism, by then being promoted in the US under the title of the New Criticism, could be integrated into a broader program for the teaching of the humanities, otherwise known as Western Civ, in a post-war, Cold War geopolitical context. Richards's biographers pointed out instances in the Red Book where his fine attention to the workings on the reader of the words on the page shows through. Few, I think, now read How to Read a Page, but I will quote one more passage from it. It occurs as Richards again checks off the common vices or disabling maladies of reading. One of those is to suppose that any possible reading of a page, be it prose or verse, is as good as any other. It isn't, Richards insists. All the value comes from the depth and honesty, the sincerity and stress of the reflection through which we choose which meanings among its possibilities we will take seriously into our considerations. These things have many meanings because they touch on us, they touch us at points at which each of us is many-minded, or even myriad-minded, as Coleridge said of Shakespeare, and Coleridge is one of Richards's touchstones. Understanding them is seeing how the varied possible meanings hang together. Which of them depend upon what else, how and why the meanings which matter most to us form part of our world, seeing thereby more clearly what our world is and what we are who are building it to live in. I mean, if this is an instance of the narrow-minded text hermetical practice of new criticism, it maybe isn't quite as hermetical as it was once cracked up to be. For if there's a more capacious, concise description than this of the stakes of a certain kind of reading, I've yet to chance upon it. For lack of an uncontroversial keyword for that kind of reading, I'm calling it the page view option. Another way of thinking about it would be as the kind of reading that makes sense of the seat back in front of you on BA or WestJet. That may be only a printed paper, papier seulement, but it could also, under the right conditions, be, well, literature. And as to what the right conditions might be, that's a question that only a new literary history as history of books and their users might now, at length, be expected to answer. And here you can see I'm marking out, not that it needs marking out, a vast field of research in which a lot of people, including present company, and further company I know on the live stream, have been hard at work for years already. Now, I promised a page from Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, putative model of Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. Here now is that page view. This is from early English Books Online. I'm sorry, it's not a very good reproduction. It's from the opening address to the reader by Burton's narrator, one Democritus Junior, or Democritus Junior, a more affable equivalent to the persona of Frye's polemical introduction. And he's setting us up for the anatomy to come by introducing us to his ancient counterpart and namesake, the laughing philosopher Democritus of Abdera, a contemporary of Socrates. And the younger Democritus quotes a letter, you'll have to trust me on this, attributed to the physician Hippocrates. The passage I'm going to quote begins about there, wherein he doth express, that is, Hippocrates doth, he doth express how coming to visit him one day, he found Democritus in his garden at Abdera, in the suburbs, under a shady bower, with a book on his knees, busy at his study, sometimes writing, sometimes walking. The subject of his book was melancholy and madness, and about him lay the carcasses of many several beasts, newly by him cut up and anatomized. Burton's anatomy is a tissue of quotations for which he punctiliously provides marginal references, or as in this case, the original text from which he's translating. And so we can see at a glance, without lifting our gaze from the page that you saw a moment ago, that he's slightly abridged his source for this anecdote in the course of paraphrasing it. The Latin runs as follows, and I do this now very reluctantly, given how many expert Latinists there are in the room. Ipse composite sedebat, supergenua volumen habens, et utrinque alia patentia parata. Dissectaque animalia cumulatim strata, quorum viscera rimabato. Literally, he was sitting in orderly fashion with a book on his knees, other books lying open and ready either side of him, utrinque alia patentia parata, and dissected animals strewn in heaps, the entrails of which he was intently examining. For those of us used to contemplating each other in book-lined offices, courtesy of Zoom, the picture of the original Democritus at work with animal carcasses piled about him is a little discomforting. What I now want you to see, however, is the books that Burton's New English Democritus left out of his account. The volumes, volumina, lying open and ready, patentia parata, on either side of his ancient Greek counterpart. I could wish that this particular Dutch genre painter had put a few more of those open volumes on display, but it is exactly contemporary with Burton's anatomy, so it's the best I could get. But he is faithful to the Latin text that Burton has truncated. The Latin word volumen originally designated a book in the form of a roll. Remember those tomes or sections of papyrus? Which was the normal form of text container for ancient philosophy, poetry, history, etc. in the Greco-Roman world until the early centuries of the Christian or so-called Common Era, when it gave way to the alternative format of the spine-hinged codex, the kind of book that has pages that can be turned and that was destined to hold sway in post-Roman, Western and global literacies until the end of the 20th century. Hippocrates and Democritus, back in whatever the 5th century BCE, should have been plying roles like this. And if you think that roll there looks a bit odd, sort of propped up there, you're right, it does. Rolls don't do that easily. You need somebody to hold them open. It makes no cognitive or physical sense for Democritus of Abdera to have had book rolls lying open around him. Book rolls don't work that way, or as book historians would now say, to lie conveniently open at a given page is not one of the affordances of a book roll. Reading a book roll takes two hands, or better still, someone else, in the ancient world often a slave, to read it to you. Whoever was responsible for the Latin text of the letter spuriously attributed to Hippocrates and quoted, abridged by Burton, that person adapted the scene of Democritus in his bower to a later technology of the book, one that made and makes it possible not only to lay out already opened books to one's left and right, but also to pile them up like an anatomist's specimens ready for serial or parallel inspection. By this account, the Greek Democritus, papier seulement, the Greek Democritus already enjoyed the page view option that the English Democritus, stand-in or sit-in for Robert Burton, was going to exploit at length in The Anatomy of Melancholy, a book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, that lays open other books with a relentlessly encyclopedic zeal. And so, finally, back to Northrop Frye. Confessions of a Literary Critic. A book is a machine to think with, writes I.A. Richards on the first page of his Principles of Literary Criticism, consciously echoing Le Corbusier. A book is a mechanical device for bringing an entire artistic structure under the interpretive control of a single person, writes Northrop Frye on page 248 of Anatomy of Criticism, surely echoing Richards, whether consciously or not. Richards, in Principles of Literary Criticism, had been beginning a book in which he would think aloud about what happens between a reader and a page of poetry. Frye, 3 decades or so later, had reached the critical or pivotal moment in the anatomy at which he needed to give an account of the rest of literature besides the parts of it that were captured by the classic and supposedly Aristotelian triad of epic, drama, and lyric. This was an issue that would still occupy Raymond Williams in Keywords, where the modern category of literature, with its etymological connection to letters or writing, is seen to have somehow subsumed, superseded, and denatured the older categories of poetry and drama, once used, as by Aristotle, for example, for oral and performance-based modes of verbal mimesis. Frye had, in fact, come to the point of thinking aloud in print about what happens when a work of literature is not only a work of writing from the start, but is also written in view of publication in a spine-hinged book, or what he calls a mechanical device that will put the artistic structure of the work under the interpretive control of a single person, which is, of course, the reader. In passing, Frye qualifies literature in that made-for-reading mode as book literature, to distinguish it from what might otherwise pass, and has in fact passed, for oral literature. But rather than labour the awkward phrase book literature, he moves quickly to entrench an alternative term destined for a glorious future in big box bookstores. The Greeks, he writes, gave us the names of 3 of our 4 literary genres, epic, drama, lyric. They did not give us a word for the genre that addresses a reader through a book, and naturally we have not invented one of our own. The nearest to it is history. But this word, in spite of Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, full title The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling, 1749, this word history has gone outside literature, and the Latin scripture is too specialized in meaning. As I have to have some word, says Frye, I shall make an arbitrary choice of fiction to describe the genre of the printed page. There is too much in this sleight of Frye's dissecting hand for us to unpack so close to the cocktail hour. the whole of the fourth and final 100-page-long section of his Anatomy on theory of genres depends on it. The arbitrariness of that section is both shocking and electrifying. The key to it is a 12-page subsection on prose fiction in which Frye accounts with breathtaking economy for the dominant genre of book literature, namely the novel, which he places on an axis with the older genre of romance. Because Frye's anatomy is nothing if not systematic, he then constructs an imaginary figure in which that romance novel axis of prose fiction is crossed by another, as it were perpendicular to it, also with two poles. One pole of that axis is, guess what? The genre of the anatomy, characterized by Frye as originally dialogical in form and encyclopedic in content. Frye discovers instances of the anatomy in all periods of Western literature since the ancient Greeks and Romans, none of them, at least in his taxonomy, requiring the dissection of animals. In Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, Frye writes, "A symposium of books replaces dialogue, and the result is the most comprehensive survey of human life in one book that English literature had seen since Chaucer." He adds, "A clearer understanding of the form and traditions of the anatomy would make a good many elements in the history of literature come into focus." Was that perhaps what President Strangway was trying to tell my future colleagues in English a few years before he accepted Cecil Green's offer to found a college for counter-encyclopedic dialogue at UBC? I like to think so. But it is the fourth form of prose fiction that Frye then places at the opposite pole to anatomy, on the axis perpendicular to the one joining romance to the novel, that sets my critical and literary historical pulse racing. We may call this very important form of prose fiction the confession form, he writes, following St. Augustine, who appears to have invented it, and Rousseau, who established a modern type of it. Nearly always, this is still Frye, some theoretical and intellectual interest in religion, politics, or art plays a leading role in the confession. It is his success in integrating his mind on such subjects that makes the author of a confession feel that his life is worth writing about. Frye names a few other instances of this confessional genre, besides those with the word confessions for a title, including Michel de Montaigne's Book of Essays, John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. If the anatomy was dialogical and encyclopedic until it became bookish and encyclopedic, then the confession appears as monological and bookish from the start. Bookishness, in any case, is the common denominator of the books that Frye places on the axis of anatomy and confession. And then, when he turns a few pages later to what he calls specific encyclopedic forms, his first and central exhibit is the Christian Bible, described by him as, quote, probably the most systematically constructed sacred book in the world. Frye's own next big book after Anatomy of Criticism would be The Great Code of the Bible and Literature, 1983. In the interim, he published a set of lectures that he'd given at Harvard under the title of The Secular Scripture, a study of the structure of romance. Contrary to his claim in the Anatomy, the Latin word scripture, the Latinate word scripture, was seemingly not yet too specialized to serve a critical purpose. Eleanor Cook showed, in an article 30 years ago, that Frye's Anatomy was also Frye's confession, the book's polemical introduction and tentative conclusion providing the space in which its author, to use his own formula confession, integrated his mind on the subject in hand. A book was a machine to think with, and it was a consistent claim of modernist literary theorists, from I.A. Richards and F.R. Leavis to the American New Critics and Northrop Frye, that literature afforded a means of mental or psychological reintegration, even perhaps a cure for the melancholic experience of living in the 20th century, to say nothing yet of the 21st. But how conscious was Frye, as he paired up those forms of anatomy and confession, in order to systematize a non-Aristotelian genre of book literature, or literature of the printed page, and so account in his Anatomy plus Confession for the whole subject of literary criticism? How conscious was he, in doing that, of relying on a page view option considerably older than that of the printed book of the post-Gutenberg West. The giveaway is his choice of Augustine's Confessions as archetype of the confession form. With no trouble at all, Frye can extend the life of the anatomy back in time before there were any books with anatomy in their title besides those requiring the dissection of animals. And yet he makes no attempt to identify any precursors to Augustine's Confessions, nor does he see fit to credit Augustine with two works that he might have classified as anatomies in his, Frye's sense, if he had been ready to allow that the turn from anatomy as dialogue to anatomy as symposium of books occurred 12 centuries before Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. In doing so, however, he would have also had to grant that the two extraordinarily influential books of Augustine's in question, the Scriptural Handbook, the Scriptural Handbook on Christian Teaching, De Doctrina Christiana, and the sprawlingly systematic City of God could belong with Frye's own Anatomy and Confession in the realm of prose fiction. Just to give you a picture of Augustine with his book open, that's from a late medieval fresco in San Gimignano. On we go. Right. Wait for it. We'll come to this. Or at the very least, Frye would, I think, have had to reconsider the wisdom of his choice of fiction as distinct from history or scripture as shorthand for a category of book literature that Aristotle had left unaccounted for. Once you allow Augustine's anatomies, as well as his confessions, into the picture, and if you're going to allow the confessions in, I'm not sure how you get to exclude the other stuff that he was up to. That arbitrary choice of Frye's to choose fiction when he could have chosen history at a pinch or scripture at a pinch looks even more arbitrary. Literature, writes John Guillory in his new book Professing Criticism, which was one of the ones I had up on the screen a moment ago. Literature, Guillory writes, is a historical object. Much of what has passed in the discipline as a theory of literature has mistaken this object for something like a natural kind. Perhaps because I read an earlier book of Guillory's 30 years ago, or perhaps because Raymond Williams basically made this point 50 years ago, I seem to have spent half my life trying to make that point, that literature is a historical object. It was only recently, though, that I realized how diagnostically useful Frye's anatomy could be for one of my current projects, which is to show that the privileged, mechanically advantaged, hands-on, disciplined but undisciplinary, readerly space of view that 19th and 20th century literary critics eventually marked out for literature, and more particularly for the critical study of literature, was first intelligently reconnoitred by a clique of Latin writing, Roman history and Christian scripture reading, freelance intellectuals at the turn of the 4th into the 5th century of the so-called Common Era. And Frye in his bones knew that already. Besides Augustine, the most creative member of that clique, was a man named Jerome, otherwise known for producing the Vulgate translation of the Latin Bible and a chronicle of universal history that would remain the basis of almost all chronography in Europe for more than a millennium after his death. In medieval and later portraits, Jerome is often accompanied, as here, by a friendly lion, and you'll notice that the lion and Jerome use the same stylist. Explaining how Jerome, Augustine, and a few others began the work of criticism that would create the conditions in the long run for literature to become the prized and contested property it was in the 20th century will be the task of a little book that I've set myself to write next year for Cambridge University Press. It will tell a story of what can be enfolded for a reader in a single fold or bifolium of parchment or paper, papier seulement, but also of what can be unfolded for a community of readers across a body of texts of roughly the dimensions of the miniature library now shelved in one corner of this room, up there, under the title of Great Books of the Western World, originally published in the US in 1952 by Encyclopaedia Britannica Inc. in 52 volumes, plus 2 volumes of introduction called spookily, for those of us at Green College, The Great Conversation and the Great Ideas, published under the associate editorship of Mortimer J. Adler, where even more spookily, the J stands for Jerome. You couldn't make this up. To tell that story, I will need to tack back and forth between two discursive forms that began to define each other and in the process also defined, somewhere between history and scripture, a new field of textual practice at the critical moment, circa 400 CE, when the political infrastructure of the Roman Empire started irretrievably to break down in the West. The two discursive forms in question are recognizable as those that Frye already identified as confession and anatomy, though only one of those terms appeared at the time, and only once, in the title of a book, by Augustine, as it happened. An anatomy, in this historical and in fact trans-historical context, is a book that articulates a notionally universal corpus of texts contained in spine-hinged books or codices. At times, it can almost be mistaken for a catalogue. A confession, on the other hand, or at the other pole, is a book that narrates in the first person, like a memoir, how a reader's cognitive affective state may be reconfigured by interaction with those texts or texts like those. Or to borrow I.A. Richards' language from 1942, how the depth and honesty, the sincerity and stress of the reflection through which individually and collectively we make out which textual meanings to take seriously into our considerations may enable us to see more clearly what our world is and what we are who are building it to live in. As subjects of book literature, most of which in practice is prose fiction, we are forever between memoir and anatomy. Another way to frame that situation would be to use the two terms paratext and architext that were put into circulation in the late 20th century by the French literary critic and theorist Gérard Genette, who in his book on the architext already engaged with Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. The added term bibliotextuality is my own coinage for the new codex-based scriptural/historical textual practice that criticism, as pursued by the likes of Jerome and Augustine, brought into focus around the year 400 CE, and that literature in the modern sense, Frye's book literature, would one day inherit. What is, or what was literature? It was, wasn't it? Having a page-framed window on the world and a well-ordered library at one's back. A 20th century and strictly modernist, Western condition we can now see. Yet one that had been long in the making before that, as an integral part of the infrastructure of the post-Roman West. If I were free, entirely free, to choose a title for the book that I'm going to try to write about Augustine and Jerome, knowing that I will not get away with Anatomy of Criticism or Confessions of a Critic, I might call it Two Men in a Book, to say nothing of a big cat. But I will probably have to settle for something more anodyne. Oops, getting carried away again. Such as Criticism Before Literature, A Space of View. But to end with anyway, wordlessly, a poem by Wallace Stevens. And now please ensure that your tray tables are in the upright position because we are suddenly coming into land. Thank you. Our speaker has ended in time for there to be a few questions. If you could address them directly to him. Or comments, objections, sustained. Marjorie.
What you think would related to, sorry, is that on? Related? Yes. To Guillory Viswanathan's Mask of Conquest, where the Macaulay's shelf of British books was promoted over the whole of Indian civilization. So then I moved to what you said about Adler and Western Civ, as if it was invented to do the same thing for American American culture in the Cold War. Do you think that works?
There's always a shelf of books. Yes. Yeah. So yes, once you allow this model of anatomy and confession, the anatomy is an extremely mobile genre, which is why I'm already equivocating quite fiercely with it, which evokes, not necessarily in straightforward catalogue form. The catalogue, I would say, is the sort of degree zero of the anatomy. Anatomy should be more fun than that. And I mean, it's great fun trying to figure out which one's favorite anatomies are, having looked at Frye's short list, and then you think, now, if I had an anatomy, which would it be? And it doesn't have to have that word anywhere near it. But the anatomy is a particular kind of fictional, dialogical, encyclopedic, symposiastic evocation of a total order of books. But you're pointing out, yes, once we start looking for total orders of books, particularly in colonial and imperial contexts, we will find them. And no wonder when most of those contexts are, in some sense or another, in the slipstream of a Roman colonial imperial worldview, as most of the ones that most of us are mainly concerned with have been. What I hope to add to the kind of analysis that Viswanathan and many others have done with respect to totalizing orders of books is to recover this insight of Frye's, if that's what in fact it was, that you can give rather an interesting account of this otherwise awkward emergent category of book literature, which doesn't consort entirely easily with any classical genre system, and which in fact has to kind of subsume the classical genre system. If you allow then that something like confession or a certain kind of memoir operates in tandem with evocations of a total order of books to bring into being a certain kind of subjectivity. And here, of course, none of this is meant to even significantly adjust the kinds of accounts that are already being given and have long since been given of how some of these procedures work. What I'm mainly interested in doing is showing that actually our accounts of those procedures and how they work are going to be more robust if we enlarge the historical frame in which we set them up. And that when Raymond Williams, for example, says, this category of literature, one begins to feel it sort of shimmering in the distance already in the Renaissance. You say, not far enough back, buddy. Frye's historical sense is of a very anatomical kind, which means he doesn't bother with dates. So you would need to press a little harder in that direction, as I've begun to do. But yes, the great books of Western Civ up there, not all of them would fall immediately within the category of Western literature, though most of them do. There are very few that wouldn't. Once you allow certain kinds of history and artistic philosophy. Freud actually is the last volume up there, so we might have an argument about that. But it really doesn't matter. The important thing is that it is synoptic in that way. It's also quite important for my purposes that it appears in 1952. Think of the other stuff of that kind and that Cold War moment. Think, since I know there are comparatists in the room, before Patricia goes after me on this, Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, the Representation of Reality in Western Literature. A totalizing account of Western literature proceeding page view by page view, translated into English, funded by the Bollingen Foundation in 1953, just where it needs to be. But for sure, those other colonial British imperial contexts, it all stacks up. I mean, I wouldn't have gone out on this limb if it hadn't been for classic work of that kind of the 1980s, 90s. kicking in really at the moment when, thanks to Raymond Williams, Edward Said, pick your favorite pivotal figure from that period in our discipline, people stopped being hung up on literature as a quasi-transcendent category and started thinking more, I don't know, historically. And now look what that's led us to. Seema.
Mark, that was absolutely dazzling, and thank you so much. I have a very quick pedantic point to make, and then I have a pedantic French point to make for a comparative reason. The first pedantic one is the addition of the new keywords, the revised vocabulary of culture and society in 2005 does not have literature in it. The only word they have under L is liberalism. But instead, what you do have is the category writing rather than literature. So that sort of also substantiates what you're saying.
Well, job done, because the editors were being very faithful to Williams.
Yes.
Who more or less led you to expect in the earlier edition that literature was about to fade from the scene, and what would he want to replace it? Yeah.
Writing, culture, yes.
My doctoral dissertation was called Ideas of Writing in Late Roman Gaul.
Wonderful.
And I started it in 1983, and it's... I didn't realize till later, of course, Williams.
Yeah.
I mean,
As for the pedantic French one, the references to Richard's main works were in the 1920s, I think it was 20. What was interesting, and this simply came to me because of the metaphors of anatomy and so on, in France at the very same time, in 1925, you were having experiments that were not analytic, but you had the production of the exquisite corpse, the cadavre exquis, that the surrealists introduced, which was pre-analytic, it was very bodily and so on. It made me think of that quotation from Wallace Stevens, where the reader became the book. And you're dealing with something that was very playful, but was also built around that image that emerged somewhat spontaneously of the corpse, because it comes from a sentence that these surrealists put together. You know, each one added a word, which was, "The exquisite corpse will not drink wine." So I don't know which one wrote exquisite, which one wrote corpse, or so on, but that became a kind of standardized game also for visual artists. And so the exquisite corpse. So you might want to consider the exquisite
so much more
corpse.
fun than anything that happens.
Well,
in
of
I.A.
course.
Richards.
I
So
was
much
going
more
to
fun.
say.
And I'm rather conscious of that. And it's unfortunate that I had to harp as I did so much on the Anglophone tradition, but there are reasons for that.
Right, of course.
But I wouldn't want it to be thought either that there was... I mean, there isn't anything in the end very special about the Anglophone tradition. And much of what happens in the 1920s in English-speaking media wouldn't have happened but for stuff that's been happening in France before that. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't thought of the Surrealist tie-in, but I don't think we'd get Stevens like this without Mallarmé
right.
and co.
Right.
And a great deal of English-American Anglophone modernism is feeding at one remove or another off les poètes maudits and the French symbolists. And so, the larger version of this would make that clearer.
Yeah.
But I think that door is already wide open. I don't think I have to beat it down.
No.
But that, yes, at the risk of making all of this other stuff look utterly tawdry, I would like to follow up the reference you've given me. Thank you.
Over a glass of wine.
Nice.
the exquisite corpse can't drink.
Henrik. Good.
I was quick on that one. You talked about reading as a mechanical activity, and I wanted to ask you about something else that's frequently seen as mechanical, and it popped up in your talk, which is translation. And I wanted to confront you with the idea by the Frankfurt School thinker Walter Benjamin, who talked about language as a broken vessel, basically saying that even the original language of the author is only a broken representation of the original idea, and that we need translations to complement our ideas of specific texts. So, for instance, to give a concrete example, the Slovenian Marxist thinker Slavoj Žižek has said that the first time we really understood the true greatness of Shakespeare's Hamlet was in the 1940s movie adaptation by the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. So shouldn't you add a third dimension to this very nice graph, which would be translation?
Well, I did manage to sneak St. Jerome in just before the end. And I think one reason why we've needed Benjamin and other continental theorists of one stripe or another, particularly those with their roots in Jewish tradition, is that we'd forgotten what we might otherwise have found quite well represented in the sort of scriptural tradition that Frye rules out as being too specialized for literary critical attention. Yeah, I mean, if everybody still read Philo of Alexandria and Origen, Benjamin would work even better. But luckily, Benjamin came along to fill out what would otherwise have been this thunderous void for lack of the transmission of some of those ideas that are indeed actually, dare I say, fundamental to the conditions of possibility for what in post-romantic, late 19th century conditions in more or less independently, but not independently across Europe, is going to be elaborated as this new quasi-transcendent category of the literary. So yeah, Benjamin is so far ahead of that game. He deserves all the play he gets. Yeah, but once one starts citing people who are on the same side of history, there'll be no end to it. If this is right, if any of these things are right, then other pieces of the puzzle will fit. But that's another particularly colourful piece. So, thank you.
2 bottles of wine to continue that.
Arnie.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mark. You used the word subjectivity just a little while ago, and I was wondering how much of that is the deciding factor, the fulcrum between the catalogue, the anatomy versus literature, and then when we look at how we look at literature today, where subjectivity is not just what's expressed in the text, but the reader brings theirs in order to even decide what is acceptable versus not in the just literature or whatever it is we call it.
Yes, I tried to cover that in a Weasley fashion by slipping in Jeanette's idea of the paratext. Now, unfortunately, like other useful critical terms, that one has been done to death. So we really need to come up with a more discriminating vocabulary. But what I was trying to suggest is there's a certain kind of text that is, as it were, supplementary, in some respects external to the larger body of texts, as anatomized in an anatomy, but which provides, as it were, the purchase. I've even been tempted in some of the work I've been doing on Augustine and Co. by the idea of the human paratext, since we're all very comfortable now with the idea that there isn't actually any clear dividing line between our sort of cognitive, affective, bodily persona and its various prostheses on which we are utterly dependent to have feelings and thoughts to the extent that we do, that thinking about paratext is actually one way of thinking about human subjectivity already. So yes, providing that extra, that not quite Archimedean point outside of a totality, which allows each of us, a way in, a point of leverage, some purchase. That I think, the domain of subjectivity, the domain of the paratextual, as you say, it's beyond the text, but it may actually be textualized too. And within the bibliographic culture of the codex, those kinds of props or aids to subjectivity have proliferated in particularly interesting ways. There's still a big argument going on among people working on the late classical, early medieval period about whether the codex form is actually inherently more fruitful of paratext than the roll form. It seems pretty likely that it was, not least because it's much easier for an individual to manipulate it pen in hand. Marginalia, interlineation, all of these operations that we used to perform on books and for which we now have more or less adequate digital equivalents, those all seem to take off in a certain set of media with the mainstreaming of the codex form. So that proliferation of paratexts, not surprisingly, can be coordinated with what looked like, well, if not actually new styles of subjectivity, then new ways of conceptualizing subjectivity. So yes, I mean, it's partly a matter of which terms one chooses and which dimension you want to discuss this in, but for sure. Adam?
Of the many things that I learned from this was why my undergraduates use the word novel to describe any book whatsoever. So thank you for that. In addition, I wanted to, I was thinking about Democritus of Abdera and the text that Burton is going back to, that
right.
part of the Hippocratic corpus.
Right.
And I wonder about what happens when you put confession next to the rant, because in that Hippocratic corpus, what is very salient is Democritus's rant that Burton is absolutely must be working from.
Okay.
And I just wonder whether the rant and the confession work in tandem in some way, or there's a useful relationship between
the rant,
those.
the confession, and the polemical introduction.
And the translator's note.
I am not as familiar with the Hippocratic corpus as I should be, but that can probably be fixed. And I also know that there's help to hand in the matter of the rant. I'll ask Dina about that. And of course, it's convenient too, since we're talking about the Hippocratic corpus, that in one of those other texts, apart from texts of Benjamin, where these things suddenly loom into an interesting focus, Foucault's essay on the author function includes the Hippocratic corpus as an instance of what he calls, doesn't he, a transdiscursive author. And one of the other groups of transdiscursive authors are the Church Fathers. And nobody working on the Church Fathers has taken Foucault up on that. They're all over his work on the history of sexuality, but that he clearly identified people like Augustine and John. Now, we don't really know what Foucault meant by transdiscursive authors to this day, but Hippocrates was one of them. Except, yeah, and the author function is interesting there, because none of that corpus is actually Hippocratic. It's all just, what is it? Well, it's rant and anatomy, and a few other things besides. Peter, and then Peter and then Philip.
Thank you. I don't know how much time I should take up on this, but I'm going to be psychopedantic. The 3 men in a boat were not hypochondriacs. Would you like me to elaborate on that?
Well,
I will, okay?
The argument is with Jerome K. Jerome, not me, but let's have it.
No, the diagnosis was yours. He didn't say they were hypochondriacs.
Are you sure?
Mm-hmm. Pretty sure. First of all, the narrator, after finding all these illnesses in himself, goes to his friend who is a doctor for a prescription. And the doctor gives him a prescription which says 1 pound of beefsteak, 1 pint of beer, and a 10-mile walk every day, and don't bother your head with things you don't understand. And that's the last you hear of his illnesses. Hypochondria is not cured by that kind of reaction.
I knew there'd be someone in the room who'd read 3 Men in a Boat more slowly.
Yeah.
Read it more slowly than I did.
And as far as the 3 of them are concerned, yes, they came up with some kind of malaise as an excuse for getting away from home, wife, and work, and go off on their little rowing trip up the Thames. But they were not hypochondriacs either. That's what you get for inviting a psychologist to this talk.
Yeah, I mean, this interdisciplinary thing is all very well, but that's what you get. Thank you, Peter. Philip.
Yeah, I was struck by the passage you were reading from Frye. You said, the passage you were reading from Frye, who said poetry's object is the poem and drama's is the play, but literature has no such object. And then I was thinking in French for a moment and realized that the French do think that the object of literature is les belles-lettres, which is not so, which seems to be a real thing. Although what is les belles-lettres? Well, who knows? But it seems to me that's a little bit closer to answering that. So Frye was a bit of a perhaps, shall we say, a slightly closed mind on this, thinking only in English, because it may be true for other languages too, but it's certainly true for French.
Well, I mean, I think what Frye is wanting to be able to point to a literary generic object, a poem, a play. Les belles-lettres is another of these discursive domains. It's one of those things whose relations to letters and literature in English modulates between the 18th and 19th centuries, and studies of the history of the word literature, letters, and cognates are still trying to track. I mean, Latin literae covers all of this stuff, but then it gets specialized and refined differently in modern European vernaculars. I mean, Erasmus bashing on about what he calls bonae literae, good, morally improving letters. And then there's this, as it were, aesthetic turn, or is it a turn towards cultivation and refinement of taste, which gives us the French belles-lettres, which is the beginning of a specialization that, you know, a few generations later gives us something like literature in French. But I don't think Frye would see that as solving his problem. I mean, it's a problem he doesn't want to have solved, and neither do I, frankly, because I think it is useful to be able to say we've got a number of these in English and in other languages in the same sort of broad set of traditions. We've got a number of quite well articulated vocabularies about quote unquote literary objects, or certainly about poetic objects, but they don't all cohere in a single field. And literature is is not actually particularly helpful. I mean, one could spend the rest of one's career, one could have spent the whole of one's career quite happily teaching poetry, fiction, drama, without ever using the word literature. And actually nowadays, I think mostly that's what we do, isn't it? On the face of it, there's no, it's like a favorite line of mine from a play by N.F. Simpson, an absurd drama called One-Way Pendulum. I always say there's no need for language. Mrs. Groom Kirby. No need for language. There's no need for literature, really, as a word. The exciting and interesting thing is that, and yet, look at the cultural prestige that it enjoyed for a while. How did it get there? Why did it matter? What was at stake? And it wasn't because it provided, you know, a particularly helpful conceptual coverage, any more than really belles-lettres did. So I think these are the issues. And I think Frye's point is good there. Poets write poetry. Dramatists, playwrights compose plays. What do you call somebody who produces literature? Or the thing she produces? It's a bit of literature. It's one of those Latinate keywords that for a while got to do a lot of conceptual and ideological legwork, and is now seemingly doing less, and has even dropped out of some of the lists. But it's still out there. I don't know whether to care about how out there it still is or not at this point. If it's a busted flush, maybe that's just as well. We can concentrate on other things. But we should know how it arose and why it counted for all that it did, and all that inheres in it, because it is, as I suggested, I wish I could bring back up that image of the infrastructure, all of those cables and wires intertwined with each other. It's part of a larger infrastructure that has to do with how places become spaces or spaces are made into places. I mean, place in a book and you make it a certain kind of space. But this is a technology. It's a technology of the self, but it's a technology of another kind too. It's collective manifestations on behalf of communities have been, among the decisive power structures in the histories that we are all quite preoccupied with again now. And this is why I think it's important to recognize that the key conditions of the possibility of the much later promotion of literature as a quasi-transcendent, quasi-metaphysical property actually can be traced to the moment of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Where would you like your Western traditions to spring from? However concealed, remystified, repurposed subsequently. Would it be so surprising if at that particular instant of cultural crisis and catastrophe, some of the top literary freelancers of the day got really creative? I mean, if the likes of Richards, Leavis, and Eliot can have the institutional effects over the last century that they evidently have had, why shouldn't similarly creative and self-willed individuals in other periods have wrought perhaps even more transhistorically effective effects? Yeah? I clearly need a drink. I expect everybody else does too. Thank you, everybody. Can't wait.